And the only thing left to do now is make the robot look as if it was actually part of the video footage. So at the moment, if we take a closer look, there's a few issues with it that are making it look obviously superimposed over the top. The first issue is the blurriness of the 3D geometry. So if we zoom in, we can see the footage is quite blurry in comparison to the robot, which is very sharp and detailed. So there's one problem we need to resolve. The second issue is the colour. So the colour balance of the robot is different from that of the video footage. And you can see this by looking at some of the white areas in the video. I'd say it's more blue. It's got more of a bluey tinge on the robot. So we need to balance the colours to match the video. And then lastly, we need to make sure that the levels are all correct, sort of matching with the white levels in the video footage as well. So to do these things, we'll go back to the compositor now. And we first need to reset the robot so that the whites are white with no tint being introduced from the HDR environment that was used to light it, which will make it much easier to match the tint of the video footage. So to do this, I'm going to Shift A, we'll drop down an RGB curve node, just like we did earlier in the beginning of the course. And I want to remove the tint from the robot. And I can do that by setting the white level. So hover over the white level, we'll press E to get the eyedropper. I'm going to choose something in the 3D scene which I know is white. So it doesn't have to be bright white, it just has to be white. So we'll choose something that we know is white, like this part here. And now that's removed all that blue tinge from the robot and it's completely white now. So we can actually look at this, if we inspect it, right click on the white part. And if we look at the bottom, we've got the RGB values. We can see that red, green and blue are pretty much all the same now, which indicates they're pretty close to pure white. So if, say for example, on this door over here in the video footage, we right click, we can see that although this is a white door, the red, green and blue values are completely different. And that's because there's some colour cast happening from the sky. Red is maybe 0.1 lower approximately than green, and green is around about 0.1 lower than blue. So we need to get the robot to match that. And the easiest way that I found to do this, if I come back out of full screen, is to take a sample. So we'll Shift A, and we'll search for an RGB node, and I'm going to sample the area of the image that I want to copy the white from. So I'll E on this, and then I'll just click on the white part on the door. And now we've got this set over here, and we can see that it's actually leaning slightly towards blue. And if we look at the values, the RGB values, these are pretty much similar to what we had when we hovered over here and did a right click and inspected a colour. So what I'm going to do now, make a bit more space, is create a second RGB curve node so that we can modify the white level again, because we're starting from a clean slate now that the robot is completely white. So Shift A, S, RGB curve node again, drop this in here. I want to pull this in the opposite direction to the one over here. So bring it up, and we can now pull this down. And as I pull it down, you'll see it's making it more blue as I go away from center, away from the blue, or if I go towards the blue, it's making it more yellow. So it does the opposite colour basically. So by dragging it in the opposite direction, I'm adding the blue in so that I can match the colour. So somewhere about there. And now the robot over here is pretty much matching up over there. We can be a little bit more technical about this, a little bit more accurate. What we can do instead of eyeballing it like that, we'll just put this back to how it was. So we'll just take out that saturation we've just added. We can actually use this. If I do Shift A, search for a separate colour. I'm going to change this from RGB to HSV, so hue, saturation and value. I'll plug this in here, and now do Shift A, and we'll search for this time a combine colour. And make sure this is set to HSV as well. Now we can plug the hue, the saturation, and I'll leave the value as 1, because we don't want to mess with the value of the robot just yet. And what we're going to do is we're going to invert the hue. So it's doing the same as what we did before when we pulled it to the opposite side. Now the hue goes from, if we look at this on the HSV, it goes from 0 to 1. So if I want this to go this way over here, I need to subtract 0.5 because this is 0 and this is also 1. So it goes 0 all the way around to 1. So to get it to go the opposite, you just, if it's gone past 0.5, you subtract 0.5, or if it was on this side before 0.5, you would add 0.5. So it's gone past 0.5, we can see it's sort of over this way, so we're going to subtract 0.5. So Shift A, and we'll search for a math node, and we'll drop this in. I'm going to change this to subtract. So that's subtracting 0.5. And then we're going to plug this in over here. And now we should get a much more accurate colour match. The next thing to do is the levels, because the levels of the robot seem to be much brighter than that of the white door over here. And we can inspect the levels by pressing N on the image editor. And we'll go into the scopes, under the waveform, and we can resize this by left click and dragging, like this. And make sure it's set to parade. Turn that opacity up or down as you want. And then you can zoom in and out by control middle mouse wheel and pushing forward and backwards as well. We can see here that we've got spikes in this area. So this red, green and blue each represent the full image from left to right, with the vertical being the levels. It's just a replication of the image but in a waveform format showing the levels of the pixels. Now these areas here where it's spiking are matching up with where the robot is in the image. So my guess is that these spikes are being caused by the robot being brighter. And we can check that if we control shift click over here on this node before it goes into the alpha over. We can then see that that is the case. The robot is way brighter. So the first thing I need to do is bring the robot's brightness down so it's within the 0 to 100 range. We want nothing to go above 100, otherwise in the output it's going to be clipped, and we want nothing to go below 0. And this is just because we're rendering to SDR. We're not rendering it out for a HDR device, just for a standard monitor or TV. So let's add another RGB curve node. And we're going to reduce the levels until they're all below 100. So let's grab this, and we'll just on the color mode, so we're operating on all red, green and blue simultaneously, rather than doing them one at a time. So I'm just going to bring this down now until they're underneath the 100 line. There we go. And you can see that the red, green and blue are going up in similar increments to when we sampled initially from the background image in the image editor. So we've got that set up. What we can do now is bring back the combination and have a look, see if that's looking better. And we need to plug this one in over here into the alpha over node to replace this one. Now you see the robot, the peaks of the whiteness on the robot are now falling within that range, but the overall robot is now looking too dark. So we need to fix that. Let's just make a bit more space. Now we don't want to push the brightness back up obviously on this side, because that's going to push all these back above 100. So instead we'll shift A, S, we'll add another RGB curve node, and now I'm going to bring up the gamma, so the mid area, until the overall brightness seems to match. So I'll bring that up until it looks about right. Maybe something around about there, maybe even a tad more. And you can look at the individual channels if it's easier for you. So red, green and blue. So I think maybe it's a little bit too bright now, so bring that back down. Maybe about there. We'll go back to colour mode. And now we should have got a decent match on both the colours and the levels. For the highlights at least. We still need to look at the blacks. Now sometimes when you raise up the gamma, you start losing the sort of details in the reflections. It becomes a little bit too lacking in contrast. So we can add a bit of contrast back in by Shift D. We'll bring that over. We'll reset this node. So just go into the N panel. And I'll just choose to reset this node so it's back to how it was. And we can add a bit of contrast back in by just bringing this down a tad and bringing this one up a little bit. And you'll see we're bringing the contrast back in between the dark areas and the bright areas. So maybe something like that. And now we should have a really nice colour match on there, and we've got the contrast and the levels right. So just before we start working on the black levels, let's just organise this tree a little bit so it's easier to understand. So let's box select these, and we'll do Shift P, and that's going to create a frame for us. And then we can go into N, and we can give this a name. So this is, we'll call this mask. We can change the size of it as well if we want to. Like so. And then this bit, all down here, is for the whites and colour correction. So Shift P, we'll call it colour correction. Make it a bit bigger. And these nodes here are the ones that are doing the actual colour correction. So select all of these, Shift P, I'll just wiggle it so it ends up back inside there, make a bit more space. Put this one in there as well. So this one is going to be colour correction. Make that a bit bigger. I think we'll actually rename this one to grading. And then these three, Shift P, are going to be, let's say, brightness, because we're doing the white level, the gamma, and the contrast. And now we can start adding the other ones to do the black levels. So Shift A, S, and we'll put down another RGB curve node. We'll drop this just on there so it ends up inside this box. And let's just change the colour of the outer frame. And we'll put this in its own frame, Shift B, move it back over there. And then this one we can call black level. Let's just have a quick look at the entire tree. It's got the mask, colour correction, brightness, and then we're doing the black level. So let's actually name this brightness, gamma, and contrast. So for the black levels, we want the 3D geometry to match the black levels of the footage. Now, before we get the robot's black levels to match the footage, we want to make sure the black levels of the footage are as good as they can be. So let's firstly just add a reroute to the wire that's coming from the background footage. So Shift right click and drag over there to add a reroute node. We'll Control Shift click on it. This will give us just a background only. So we can see in the scopes over here, that's all we can see. Now, if we just make this a bit bigger, we can see that the red channel is almost at the 0 line, whereas the green and the blue are considerably above it. Now, this is because of the colour balance of the actual scene. And whilst we might want to modify this so that the red, green and blue are all at the 0 line, that will change the colour balance of the footage, which you might not want to do. But if you did want to do it, we would do Shift A. In fact, let's just copy one of the existing RGB curve nodes we've got. So I'll press Shift D on this one to duplicate it. Right click, drop it into the same place. We've now got two RGB curve nodes there. And to be able to move it outside of this frame, we'll press Alt P. And now we can move that out of the frame and onto the wire that we want to modify. So onto this one. And by the way, before we modify this, I just want to point out, if you come to the bottom of the scopes, we've got the samples option where we can change it to be full sample. Now, if we come back up, you'll notice that if we just turn these up a little bit, we have actually got pixels on the blue channel and most likely on the green channel that are all the way down to the 0 line. But they're so small and few and far between that it's not actually perceivable to the human eye in the image. So what I'm going to do instead is leave it at 30%, and I find that that more accurately resembles what's perceivable to the human eye. Firstly, we'll bring the red down. I want to make sure that that is all the way down to 0. So it's very slightly above. And it's just a small amount to come down that I'm going to use the value inputs instead of trying to control it with this point. So first I'll click the point so that we get the values for it. And I need to move this way to make it darker. So that's going to be on the x-axis, which is the first box. So in here, I'm going to put 0.001 and press enter. And you'll see that's taken that down all the way to 0. In fact, it's gone very slightly below it. So let's put 0.000, let's go with 7. And there we go. So that's perfectly on the 0 line now. Now, if I wanted to change the colour balance and get a bit more contrast in the darks, what I could do, as I mentioned, is bring the green and the blue down separately. So I'll just do the same thing. I'd select this black point, and then I'd change this to something like 0.002. And there we go. So that's practically at the 0 line. And then we'll do the same for the blue. Choose this point at the bottom, and we'll go with 0.002 again. And that's going to bring that down as well. But I don't want to do that because I want to maintain the original colour balance of the footage. Even though it might look a little bit nicer, I'd prefer to keep the original footage as it is. Let's set these back to 0 for the blue and for the green. And now we've made sure that the darkest pixel across any of the channels is at the 0 line. We can now come across here. Just move that up a bit. Get rid of this. We can now come across to the robot's black levels and start modifying this. So let's plug this back in over here so we're getting both images combined. And we can see we've got the robot's black levels in the middle there, which currently go all the way down to 0. So to match these up, we could use the trick we did earlier. We'll look at a different way. Firstly, the red's fine because that's all the way down to 0. But the green, you can see, is much lower on the robot than it is in the background image. So onto the green channel. We'll set this bottom point. And then this time we want to move it upwards. So this is going to be in this direction, which is on the Y channel. So I'm going to move this up by 0.005. See what that looks like. And you'll notice when we did that, it actually affected the background footage as well. So let's have a look at what's happening over here. We'll make it a bit more obvious by moving it higher up. So the reason for this is that the alpha over node requires the transparent pixels of the robot input, so the robot rendered frame, to be completely black. Otherwise, it will modify the pixels of the background as well. So what we need to do is limit the amendments we make to the black channel of the robot just to the pixels that aren't transparent. So to do that, we'll use the alpha output of our rendered frame. So let's shift click on this to select it on the alpha output. And then we'll come across the factor of the black level, shift click on this, and then we'll say F to fill. And now it's limiting that just to the actual pixels that aren't transparent. And the background footage, as a result, will remain untouched. Okay, so with that done, let's bring this one back down. I'm just relying completely on the scopes now. And I want to bring this one up a little bit until it matches the background's lowest point here. So make sure I'm on the green channel. We're going to move it on the Y. So I'll put in 0.00, maybe 2. That's a bit too high, so 0.001. And I'd say that's pretty much spot on. And by the way, when you enter in values, after you've finished, so if I put 0.001 and press enter, I can then press enter again, providing my mouse is still over the input. And that will make that input active again, so I can begin typing without having to use the mouse to select it again. So I'll just press escape. And now we'll go to the blue channel. So the blue channel on the background is about here, and the blue channel on the robot is a little bit lower, about here. So we go to the blue channel, select the black point, and then we'll put in here 0.001 again. And I'd say that's pretty much spot on. So now we've matched up the black levels of the rendered geometry to the black levels of the footage. So now we've matched the colour and we've also matched the levels. Next thing to do is match the blurriness. Now, any blurring that I add, I need to make sure I do it before the alpha over, because obviously I don't want to start blurring the background footage. We could start limiting it with the alpha pass, but it's probably easier just to put it in this section here. To make this process as easy as possible, what we'll do, we'll find a frame in the footage that has the least amount of blur. So it's quicker to do this in the motion tracker or the video editor. We'll go to the motion tracker and I'll just hide all the trackers we've got. So make sure we're in the tracking mode, and I'll just hide all these. Press H. And now I'm going to play through and find a frame somewhere where the robot is close to the camera, where it's not so blurry. So let's go and play this through. So this frame here, 114, I'd say that's pretty much, it's not got much motion blur, so the only blur we're going to be seeing is the actual blurriness of the footage itself without the influence of motion. So 114, we'll go back to the compositor. Let's get rid of these scopes now, we don't need those anymore. We'll zoom in, and I want to find an area where we can see the difference quite clearly. So obviously, this is very sharp compared to this. So we'll add a blur node, Shift A, search for a blur node, and we're going to go with Gaussian. I'm going to put this down here. I think maybe the robot's a bit too far away there actually. Let's try and find another frame a bit closer to the camera. So go back to the motion tracker. Just there. So 137 looks pretty crisp. Let's go back to the compositor. I'll just update this by ticking one of the boxes and unticking it. That's better, so we're a little bit closer. Right, so we can see virtually no detail at all on these flowers, but we can still see the details of the robot quite clearly, like the little bits of the knee and things like that. So I'm just going to increase the X and Y value to something like 2, just to make that a little bit more blurry now, and it's matching much more nicely with the footage. If I just mute this, you can see that's really crisp, but as soon as we turn this back on, it's just fitting much more nicely with the footage. And because the X and Y values on the blur node are the pixel values, how many pixels it's going to blur by, as the robot gets further away and smaller, then the robot will appear to be slightly more blurred, which will help to match that very slight depth of field effect we've got on the footage. And if you wanted to, you could actually more accurately mimic the depth of field in the footage by animating the size value on the blur node at different points in time. So it could be more blurry as it's farther away, and then the size could reduce as it gets closer. Additionally, you could do the same thing for the background footage as well. If you wanted to emulate the camera switching focus to the robot as it gets closer, then you could place a blur node on the background footage and animate it to become more blurry as the robot comes closer to the camera. Completely up to you. For me, I preferred not to do it in this video because I preferred the result without, but it's something to experiment with if you'd like to. The next thing we need to do is add the motion blur, because when the camera's moving in the video footage, obviously the blur increases quite dramatically in the video footage. So we need to get the robot to do the same thing. And this is why we rendered out the vector and the depth pass. And we need to make sure we do this before this blur, otherwise this blur is going to modify the pixels of the robot, and then these depth and vector passes that we've created won't match up anymore. So let's make sure we put it before the blur node. And we'll do Shift A. We're going to search this time for blur, but we're going to use the vector blur. So this is basically motion blur. We'll plug this into the image, and now we need to supply it with the depth and the speed. And this is from here on this node. So we'll shift click on this socket, the depth. I'm going to come across here to the Z, which is the depth, shift click on that, and now press F to join them. And I'll do the same thing, so shift click on the speed. Now come across to the vector, shift click on it, and press F to fill those in. And just tidy it up a little bit, make ourselves a little bit more space. And we can use reroute nodes by shift right clicking and dragging to move them up a little bit here. And we'll do the same here as well. Bring these across. Okay, so with this turned on, based on the inputs we've given it, it's already going to be working. And this is going to be giving us a lot more blur in motion. So let's go to a frame where we've got a lot of motion, maybe towards the end. So let's try maybe 160. It's going to take a little bit longer to update the frame now because the vector blur is quite expensive. But you can see now we're getting much more blur on the robot's arm movement. Let's try actually 174. I think we've got a bit more arm movement on that frame. There you go. We've got the motion blur on the robot, and if we come right to the end, maybe 240, where the robot is moving past quite quickly, you can see we're getting much more of an effect from that motion blur. If we just turn this off, you see it's much more crisp. So turn this back on. The samples is for the quality. So if you start seeing, if you've got low samples like 8, then you're going to get much less quality, and you're going to start seeing the actual ghosting on the robot. Whereas if you change this to something like 32, then you're not going to see the individual sort of outline anymore in the blurred area. So 32 is usually good, and I normally keep the blur to 1, and then I don't really touch these. The curved option is if you've got an arc in motion. This might do a little bit of a better job, but I'm going to leave it turned off just for speed. And then finally, you remember when we did the motion tracking, the motion tracker calculated the distortion of the camera. So we need to make the 3D object also distort in the distorted areas of the camera as well. So it's a perfect matchup with the footage. And this is what the node we had earlier, the distortion node, is for. So we need to make sure we put this, obviously, over here after the blur. We can't again put it before the vector blur, otherwise the vector blur inputs aren't going to match, just the same as we couldn't do that with putting the vector after the blur. So we'll put it last in this row, and we need to make sure it's set to distort. And if I just mute these two nodes here just for speed, just to make it a bit faster, and we'll go towards the end now, edge of the screen, where the distortion in the camera is much more obvious. So maybe 260. Maybe a bit too far. Let's go with 250. There we go. So at the edges of the screen, as soon as I turn this distortion off, you should see that the robot actually becomes undistorted. So turn it back on. It's now using those distortion values that we found over in the motion tracker. If you remember, in the track settings under camera, these lens distortion values, which we could automatically find during the solve. So over in the solve, we had the option to refine the radial distortion and optical center, and that's what these are for. So yeah, that's where it's getting its information from, and it's just distorted it to match up with the footage. So let's turn all of these back on. Now the robot is fully integrated with the footage. And there we go. Pretty much spot on.